This is American Yoga School, a short lesson on muscle rolls and how to move the body. First, a joint is where two bones come together. When we're practicing asana, the shape that the body is in is determined by the position of each of the body's many joints, whether it's neutral or whether it's moved from neutral. The primary mover of joints are muscles. When we're teaching how to do things, we're basically teaching where to work, where to contract, where to let go. Muscles are contractile tissue. You can see here in this image that this muscle is made up of bundles of little things. The muscles are made of bundles of fibers. And so these little fibers of muscle can get shorter by spinning, basically, like you would wring out a washcloth. As you spin the washcloth around itself, the two ends would come toward each other. We have millions and millions of those in any muscular contraction, and because they're all grouped together, all of these little microscopic washcloths spinning around each other, the entire unit that is that muscle gets shorter. Skeletal muscle is attached to at least two different bones, and since the two ends of the muscle come toward each other, that's how a movement is initiated. The bones that the contracting muscle attaches to, as that muscle gets shorter, it brings those bones toward each other. For this lesson, we're going to use Paschimottanasana to Dandasana, or Dandasana to Paschimottanasana as an example. When you go from Dandasana to Paschimottanasana, the top of the pelvis is brought toward the femur. So the front top pelvis is drawn toward the thigh bone. Here you can see that in Dandasana, there's a 90-degree approximately angle between the center line of the femur and the center line of the pelvis. And then in Paschimottanasana, in this example, there's about 50-degree angle there, meaning that the practitioner has moved about 40 degrees from the starting pose. We do that by bringing the top of the pelvis toward the femur. So if muscles contract and bring two bones toward each other, we know there must be a muscle that connects these two bones, the pelvis and the femur, and that when it contracts, it brings them closer together. That movement is called hip flexion. These muscles, as a group, are called hip flexors, and we don't need to look at the individual muscles to understand today's lesson. So when a muscle gets shorter and pulls two bones toward each other, it's referred to as an agonist. So it's the muscle that's contracting and getting shorter to make a movement happen. In this case, we're going to just call them the hip flexors, are the agonists. But as the top of the pelvis is brought closer to the femur, you can see from the sit bones, that's the part of the pelvis that's facing downward at her hand on the left image, you can see that those sit bones move away from the femur as she folds. So the muscles that connect the bottom of the pelvis, the sit bones, to the thigh bone, these are hip extensors, by the way, they have to let go some in order to allow hip flexion to happen. If they remained as contracted and as short as they could be, you wouldn't be able to move from Dandasana to Paschimottanasana. So while the fronts of the thighs, the hip flexors, work to make the movement happen, they're called agonists. In the back of the hip, the muscles have to let go enough to let the movement happen. It doesn't mean that they have to relax completely. In fact, they can be contracted, but they do have to lengthen, whether it's passively or actively, to allow the movement to happen. So that's called the antagonist. A third role is that of stabilizer. So she's doing a forward bend, and we're doing it to flex the hips. The hip flexion is sort of the main event of this pose. So it would be easier to do if she bent her knees, but then that wouldn't target the hip as much. The pose wouldn't be as effective for what we typically use Paschimottanasana for. So she's keeping her knees very straight. She's also keeping her spine from rounding excessively. It's borderline rounded here, but it would be rounding much more if she wasn't trying to keep the spine from completely rounding. So the muscles that hold the knee straight and the muscles that prevent excessive rounding in the upper back, those are called stabilizers. And by keeping basically the leg side of the hip joint still and the torso side of the hip joint still, we isolate the movement at the hip joint. This is a horribly important concept to understand for people who are trying to increase range of motion. And I chose these poses as an example because this is an area where many would benefit from increasing range of motion. So to make this forward bend really effective anatomically, we keep the legs still, we keep the legs straight, we keep the spine from completely rounding, and we move only at the hip joint. So the most effective effort will happen when we teach the muscle at the joint to move the joint, and we teach other muscles at the joint to let go enough to allow that movement to happen. What we call this in the American Yoga School teacher training is the tapas point. Tapas is a word that literally means to purify through heat, by burning. And it can be taken literally, but it figuratively refers to the fact that when we burn something, and there are many ways to burn something, we always change it. It always changes its form. So what we're looking for on the yoga mat a lot of times is this tapas point. This is where the most effective work can happen. So if we can work at the hip joint where we isolate the actions that move it, we are aware of the actions that allow it, and we're aware of the other things, the other efforts that stabilize, we can really clearly find where the point is that where going any further would be moving past the limit that each of these three roles can be played by the muscles that are playing them. When we stop there and work, the practitioner physically actually changes those limitations. So let's say in this example, the practitioner is not able to fold as far forward because the antagonists, the backs of the legs, are not letting go very much. Well, if we stop right at the point where going further would mean further rounding the back or bending the knees, then we're going to work the muscles that will pull the hip into deeper flexion, and we're going to give the muscles in the back of the leg time to lengthen. We're going to change the limitation, whether it's a strength limitation or a flexibility limitation. If the back is weak or the muscles that straighten the knee are weak, then and we stop at the point before they give out, we strengthen them. So by really being clear about where this point is, we really get to the place where the most effective change can happen. But then what I think is even more important, to me at least as a yoga teacher, is the mental tapas that happens at that point. So if you can bring a student to the point where going further would challenge them, you're doing a number of things. You're, first of all, putting them into a place of challenge where they can witness and observe what happens in the mind when they're challenged. Do they welcome it? Do they beat up on themselves? Are they fostering and propagating mental patternings that will serve them or that are harmful? Further, we are challenging what we believe the body to be. So much of our ego is attached to what our body can do. I've heard many students say, I have tight hamstrings, or I can't do that, or I can't touch my toes. What they're doing, even though it's not very pleasant, is that they've made this fixed definition of their body. And when you work with the body in this way, where you find the tapas point, you see that it's extremely elastic and malleable. The body is always, always changing. So there's a real problem when we attach our identity to something that's really fluid. It's like expecting the surface of the ocean to stay the way that it was a moment ago. The body's not quite that dramatically changing, but it is that constant. So while there's great problems that arise from attaching identity to our body, there's also great benefit to be found in observing that the body is changeable, that it is constantly changing, and that in an asana practice we can visit those places where the challenge happens, where the shift can happen, and that we can do our yoga practice physically in a way that takes the body into a much less healthy, strong, and flexible place, or we can choose to take it into a place that is more functional, where things that need to be strong get strong, and things that could be more open get more open, and where things that function just perfectly are recognized as such. All of this happens when you recognize the roles of muscles, you understand where we're going and why in asana, and we teach and practice with the muscles playing these roles and stopping when they can't play them anymore. Thank you very much for listening. Visit AmericanYogaSchool.com if you'd like to know more about our teacher training programs.